And here we are again, Kathleen Martens.
Karen Pugliese. Nice to see you again.
You see, we're doing so many of these because you've done so many stories for Investigates, you were there so long, and I think you've won more awards than any other reporter.
I do have the record, but you know, those whippersnappers, they're coming up behind me, and I'm sure they're going to pass me and set another record. But yeah, for now, I think I hold the record.
Well, there you go. You set the right bar.
Yeah.
So, I mean, we've talked before about residential schools. We're back talking about residential schools again because, I mean, you did a lot. Like, you've got a huge body of work, I think more than any other reporter, on covering through not just residential schools, but the different systems, the different compensation systems, how they fell apart, when they weren't fair, lawyers who were fleecing people, and as a result of your stories, got caught. So this is we're going to see a half-hour piece on this one, but the original piece was 1 hour, and it's still up online if anybody wants to see the full hour. And it really puts all of this together.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, we have to remember too that these are processes that started a long time ago. You know, it's easy for us to write, oh, well, in this year this came into effect and it lasted for 5 years. You know, there's an incredible amount of work that's done leading up to the point where the settlement is reached, and then it has to be certified by a judge, and then, you know, it has to be, the information has to go out to the class members, and then they have to sign on, and then they hire lawyers, and then they go through that process, and a whole bureaucracy was created to help, you know, get these forms through the system, so to speak, and get the compensation to who needed it. And then the aftermath, you know, which was how many people were paid, who didn't get paid, why didn't they get paid, you know, all of that. So there's never a lack of stories to do on these issues.
Well, you know, let's go like way back. I'm wondering, when was the first time you ever heard of residential schools?
You know what? I grew up in sort of a southern inner city neighborhood in Winnipeg, and there was one down the street.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was, I don't know the name of it, but I remember hearing about it growing up, but not knowing what it really was, you know. But I did know of it, but absolutely nothing until I started working at APTN in 2010. And I remember Paul Barnsley, the man, the myth, the legend, you know, the boss, the creator of Investigates, in my job interview, asking me a number of pointed questions about seminal moments in Canadian political and Indigenous history. Who's Dudley George? You know, and he'd throw out like these names, and who's this, and what happened, and da-da-da. And then he said, how would you treat residential school survivors? And I said, with as much respect as humanly possible. And he seemed to like that answer. I was so glad he didn't ask me, and what is a residential school? But boy, I got a crash course in it. You know, he, as much as I have this body of work that you mentioned, he was right there beside me. And if anybody really can't sleep one night and wants to look online, there are many stories on our website. And Paul was a double byline with me because his knowledge of politics and the way Indigenous issues are dealt with by Ottawa was just incredibly important in doing the story and in understanding how they come to make these settlement agreements. And then it collides with class action law, and you know, you got some of the lawyers that play recurring roles in these class actions. And so Paul was right there, and often if I can't think of a name, you know, I'll say, okay, remember that guy we talked to, and he came in that day, and he was wearing this, and he didn't get his money, and he wanted to buy a car. Oh, yeah, and then Paul remember, like, his name or the community that he's from. You know, we had a fellow come in to the office in Winnipeg, and he said, I live in the Inner Lake on a reserve. There's no public transportation. I want to be able to come into the city so I can take a computer upgrading course. You know, I was hoping I was going to get maybe $10,000. I didn't get very much in my settlement. Can you just look at my papers? And we were at the point where if someone just sent us the form, we could tell like in an instant whether it had been done right or wrong, if they'd been overcharged or not. Like we just became experts on these forms. And we said, send us your paperwork. So he came in one day with it. We sat down with him. We looked at it. We said, oh, yeah, yeah. The next day, I called his lawyer. She didn't call me back. She had 2 offices, one in 2 different provinces. I called both offices. Normally, I just say my name, where I work, call me back. This time I said, I've looked at the paperwork. He was overcharged. I want to talk to you about that. I never heard from the lawyer, but he called me probably 2 weeks later to say he got a check in the mail for $10,000.
Wow.
And so he was so happy he bought a used car. And that's, I mean, it's not like the guy asked for $100,000 or $1 million, like, which I'm sure he could have easily deserved, you know. He just wanted to buy a used car. And he was ripped off. And I'm going to go out on a limb and say, I think the lawyer knew that, because without even calling me back, cut the guy a check. No questions asked.
Yeah, that's really suspicious.
And how many clients do they have?
Yeah.
You know, and so then I said, I'd go into Paul's office, I'd say, look, can you just pay me to do this job, but I won't really do it? I'll just sit at my desk, call lawyers up, and say, I've got the paperwork. Did the people get paid the correct amount? I said, just think of the good we could do.
Yeah.
He says, yeah, I know, but that's not our job. I'm like, yeah, I know. So we've looked at many forms. We still have survivors call us on an almost daily basis. We have people call, I have people messaging me on Facebook. I belong to a number of survivor groups on Facebook. I mean, just because the IAP window has closed, it doesn't mean, you know, people just go back to their lives. They still compare notes. They still talk to each other. They're still trying to understand what they kind of went through, like this system they went through. And did I get ripped off? Did I get the right amount? What is my recourse now? Which, of course, is none. But then they're concerned because there's other class actions, you know, 60 Scoop, Day School, they're all going to be going through it. You know, they want to say, hey, here's what happened to me. Make sure that doesn't happen to you in that settlement agreement. So as Canada moves to, you know, make apologies and redress these wrongs, and of course, these are vulnerable claimants who were wronged and deserve compensation, doesn't mean that those settlements can't be improved. Like the way that the lawyers work with them, the way they treat them, and, you know, the way we do our job can't stop. We still have to keep an eye on all of this, right? It's millions of dollars, billions of dollars in taxpayer money, and we have to make sure that it's going where it's supposed to go. That's our job, you know.
And through it all, it's this human factor. Like I think I mean there was no talking about residential schools when I was growing up. I heard or learned about them in university, and then I went out and I did a history paper because I was doing a combined honors with journalism and history, and I was looking at the war to war period, and I went in to see. I wanted to see if in the records, because the records are all there, if abuse was identified as abuse back in the day, because at that time that was one of the questions, right?
Interesting.
It was, well, you know, but that was normal for that time. Oh, sure, but everybody got the strap, everybody. And so I was looking back to see what language was used, and there was language used. This is abuse. They had people that they knew were sexually assaulting kids, and at first the government moved in to fire them, and then at a certain point they start saying, let the churches handle it. Let the churches handle it. And there's a lot of literature being written at the time because the cases were firing up. You know, there were a lot of people going out and hiring historians to do research on these schools and write these books. The history was written very differently than history about other Indigenous people because it was being written for Indigenous people. So almost every book had a chapter on resistance, which you didn't see typically in history books about Indigenous people. But the part that I remember is just doing my paper and reading through the records of the missing kids. The missing kids and the kids that ran away,
right.
And the parents asking, like, you investigate this. My kid ran away and froze to death. He ran away without shoes on.
Yeah.
What happened in that school that was so bad to make that happen? And they're like, well, there's no need for an investigation. The child froze to death. What would we possibly investigate?
Well, it was the kid's own fault for running out without a coat.
Yeah. Yeah, crazy Indians, right? And I just read so many of those stories. I just sat there and I said, I will never do I'll never do this again. So I mean, if you're that affected by it without being affected by it, like, I just can't imagine what people went through. And you have a character in your story that you talk to, and I think it's important, that connection between not having anybody raise their own kids for 3 generations, why alcohol and drugs come into it.
It very much answers a lot of questions, I've been covering several hearings for the Missing and Murdered Women inquiry, and we hear about parents who went through residential school are now parents of missing or murdered Indigenous women or girls, and they themselves are saying, I didn't parent, I didn't know how to parent, or I wasn't in any shape. I was, drinking, or I was just unable to cope with the demands of parenthood because of the trauma that I experienced. And so I didn't necessarily, the parents are always blaming themselves. They may have been perfect parents and still their daughters would have been missing, but some of them testifying are blaming themselves and saying, I couldn't parent because of what happened to me in residential school, and now I've got a missing daughter, it's all to them, it's connected. And we're seeing that again, and even 60 Scoop, we're going to hear how I'm sure that some of them were children of residential school survivors, right? So it very much tells you the story of what has happened, but almost kind of going backwards,
I think another element that you had, it comes up in the story, but it was something that you worked on, was just, you talked about the charges and people being overcharged. But there were these cases piling up where lawyers were taking them on, and they couldn't possibly process them all.
That's right. This one lawyer who, was probably on his way to being disbarred, and in the end was allowed to resign. So he's no longer a practicing lawyer, but he had what they called like a conveyor belt system, where he set up an office of processors and form fillers. So they went out, they worked with survivors to fill out as many forms as humanly possible, thousands, like over 6,000 forms. And then they came into an office where they were processed by like almost just data input people. And then just various lawyers would go to the hearings. You wouldn't get one particular lawyer. And they called it like I'm trying to think of the word that the judge wrote because this was
like an assembly line.
Assembly line, thank you. Like the judge said, this assembly line approach to delivering justice to residential school survivors is just, I think she wrote, like, is beyond the pale. It is so far from what the IAP was supposed to do and the settlement for residential school survivors was supposed to do. From a strictly business point of view, if you want to break it down, it's probably like, hey, that sounds very efficient. From a legal point of view, I think that's not exactly delivering justice or legal services. And he was censured for that. A big report was written. A judge kicked him out of the IAP and said, listen, dude, you got to be a lawyer. That's not what a lawyer does. And you need to meet with your client. You need to hear what their story is. You need to make sure they're getting the best representation and the most compensation under the settlement for what they went through. You're not doing that. So it was something that we still shake our head about. And now, like with the settlement that's being offered to a couple of groups that were affected by the 60 Scoop, they don't need a lawyer. Like, there's law firms involved, but I've gone online, I've sat beside a 60 Scoop survivor as she filled out the form. It takes 10 minutes. It's very simple. And so now if someone calls me and says, well, my lawyer, I'm like, wait a minute, you don't need a lawyer. I've seen this form. Where are you on the form? And can you print it off? Just be careful. Don't go to a private law firm. You don't need it. The government is paying $75 million to 4 law firms that are that helped broker this deal, and as part of that, any legal services you need are free. You just call those firms if you need a lawyer, but you really don't. Anybody, I mean, most people I think could do the form. So right away, I know there's still a way that somebody can get in there and make money, but we're just trying to spread the word. Almost every story I write, I'm like, you know, you don't need a lawyer. You know, I mean, it's not really journalism to say that, but you just want to kind of help get the word out that please.
Well, providing people with information they need.
It's a fact, yeah.
It's a fact.
Yeah, and you just don't want to see people ripped off. Yeah.
So it sounds like some lessons learned by the system. Hopefully a change in the system so it doesn't repeat itself.
I don't know. I mean, certainly, I don't know how many other people share this opinion, but just in writing stories about this, you know, it sounds like the legal profession needs reform. You know, I can't tell you how many times I've heard there's just a few bad apples speech. But I mean, it's starting to be there's more bad apples than good. And at what point where's the tipping point for the legal profession to say, listen, when it comes to these things, like this is guaranteed money, right? It's coming from the federal government. Do you really need 20, 25, 30% fee to do a form? I mean, they made millions of dollars. And now again, like it is often about the money. And I mean, lawyers are not ashamed of making money. You know, being a wealthy lawyer is something a lot of people aspire to. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but you know, you have to, and if you specialize in class action, great, more power to you. But I mean, let's not. Do you have to squeeze every last penny out of it in a way that's hurting the actual people that the settlement was set up to help? And we can show you where that's happening, right? We've done stories on that where people are taking advantage. And Thomas Berger, you know, a respected jurist, wrote what's considered the tome of kind of an outline of what the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement was all about, and reminded everybody that these are vulnerable claimants. You know, many of them, English is not their first language. They were not educated, you know, they did slave labor. I mean, this is not someone who is savvy around a form, you know. Like, be charitable, be kind, be a lawyer, but also have some compassion and some understanding. Be a human about it. Right. Don't say, hey, just sign an X there and I'll add a 0. You know what I mean? Like, that's, I'm not saying that's happening, but it feels like it is. You know? So
there's more there that you're going to be keeping an eye on.
That's right. Yeah, sorry, but that's my long way of saying, oh, my work isn't done here. But, you know, they now know, I think, that a story's going to come. If I'm on the phone, you guys have done something wrong sometimes, right?
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're there, and I'm glad you're doing this work.
Thanks, Karen.
Thanks again for talking to me.